Morgan Freeman walked into the press conference with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen it all. His deep, resonant voice alone could command a room, but today, it was his presence that sent a chill through the air. He wasn't here for himself. He was here for Clint Eastwood, his longtime friend, a man he respected, and someone he refused to let be slandered. Across the room, the reporters sat ready, their pens and recorders in hand, some smirking, as if they already had their headlines written. They had tried to tear Clint apart before, accusing him of being outdated, controversial, even problematic. Today they wanted blood again, but they hadn't counted on Morgan Freeman standing in their way. "Mr. Freeman," one of them began, pushing his glasses up his nose with an air of smug confidence. "You've worked with Clint Eastwood for years. Given his, let's say, old-fashioned views, do you think he's still relevant in today's Hollywood?" Morgan chuckled, shaking his head slightly. "Let me tell you something," he said, leaning into the mic. "Clint Eastwood doesn't need to stay relevant. Clint defines relevance. He's been shaping this industry longer than most of you have been alive. So let's not act like he needs permission to exist in it." The room went still for a moment before another reporter jumped in. "But surely you recognize that some of his statements and films have been criticized as being out of touch, even offensive?" Morgan's eyes narrowed. "Offensive?" he repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Tell me, what's offensive? That Clint Eastwood tells stories without bending to the trends? That he directs with honesty, not with fear of who might be upset on Twitter?" The reporter shifted, in his seat. "Well, society has changed, and many feel that his views don't align with—" Morgan cut him off with a raised hand. "Let me explain something to you," he said. "You don't get to decide who's allowed to have an opinion. You don't get to cancel a man because he doesn't fit into the neat little box you want him in. Clint Eastwood has given more to this industry, to storytelling, to the art of cinema than 1,000 online critics combined. And yet here you are trying to tear him down because he refuses to be anything other than himself." A few reporters exchanged glances, but Morgan wasn't done. He leaned forward, his voice lowering just enough to make everyone lean in. "You see, the problem isn't Clint. The problem is people like you, who think that if someone isn't speaking your language, if they aren't parroting your talking points, then they must be silenced. But let me remind you, Clint Eastwood has faced tougher men than anyone in this room, and he's still standing. You can write your headlines, spin your stories, but you will never erase a man like him." The room was quiet now. The reporters who had come in expecting an easy shot at an aging Hollywood legend were left stunned, their carefully prepared narratives crumbling under the weight of Morgan's words. He stood up, adjusting his jacket, and gave one last look around the room. "You wanted a story? There's your story," he said. "Clint Eastwood doesn't answer to you, and neither do I." With that, Morgan Freeman walked out, leaving behind a room full of speechless journalists and a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. As Morgan Freeman strode toward the exit, the silence in the room lingered like an awkward aftertaste. The reporters, so eager just moments ago to tear down Clint Eastwood, now found themselves fumbling for a response. Some shifted uncomfortably. In their seats, others hastily scribbled notes, desperate to salvage whatever angle they could. Just before reaching the door, Morgan paused. He turned back, his piercing gaze locking onto the very reporter who had first spoken. The man's confidence had faded, but he still clutched his pen like a lifeline. "You know what's funny?" Morgan said, his voice even but sharp. "For all this talk about progress, fairness, and open-mindedness, you folks sure do love putting people in a box. Clint isn't the one out of touch. You are. He doesn't owe you an apology for being himself, for making films his way, for telling the stories he wants to tell. That's what real artistry is. It's not about pleasing the loudest voices in the room. It's about truth." A woman near the front, emboldened by the lull, cleared her throat. "Mr. Freeman, with all due respect, don't you think it's fair for people to challenge outdated ideas?" Morgan's lips curled into a slight smirk. "Fair? Sure. But that's not what this is. This isn't about fair debate. This is about control. You want people to think a certain way, speak a certain way, and if they don't, you try to destroy them. That's not progress. That's just a different kind of tyranny." The woman opened her mouth to respond, but Morgan wasn't interested in a back and forth. He had said what needed to be said. He straightened up, nodded once, and turned on his heel. As he exited the room, he pulled out his phone and dialed a familiar number. After a couple of rings, the gravelly voice of Clint Eastwood answered. "How'd it go?" Clint asked, amused. Morgan chuckled. "Let's just say they won't be forgetting that press conference anytime soon." Clint laughed softly on the other end. "I figured. Knew you'd handle it." Morgan stepped outside, feeling the crisp air hit his face. "Damn right I did. Now how about that drink?" Clint sighed theatrically. "As long as you're buying." Morgan shook his head, smiling as he walked toward his car. Yeah, old man, I got you." And with that, two legends carried on, unbothered by the noise, unshaken by the critics, and completely untouchable. Later that evening, Morgan Freeman pulled up to Clint Eastwood's favorite bar, a quiet, old-school joint tucked away from the chaos of Hollywood. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where the jukebox still played Sinatra, and the bartender knew your drink before you sat down. As Morgan stepped inside, he spotted Clint at a corner table, a glass of whiskey already in his hand. The man hadn't changed. His presence was as sharp as ever, his eyes carrying that same steely resolve that had made him a legend. Morgan slid into the seat across from him and gestured to the bartender, who nodded, already preparing his usual. Clint took a sip of his drink, then smirked. "So I assume I'm still public enemy number one?" Morgan chuckled. "Oh, they tried. They thought they had you cornered, Clint, like you were some frail old man they could push around." He ducked shook his head. "I reminded them real quick who they were dealing with." Clint sighed, setting his glass down. "You didn't have to do all that, Morgan." "Oh, I had to," Morgan said, pointing a finger. "You weren't there to defend yourself, and I wasn't about to let those people rewrite history while you were off minding your own damn business." Clint's smirk widened. "Still got that fire in you?" "Always." Morgan leaned back as his drink arrived, taking a slow sip. "But you know, this whole thing just proves a point. They don't care about truth, Clint. They care about control. They want to make people afraid to speak their mind, to tell real stories, and you're dangerous to them because you don't give a damn what they think." Clint nodded, running a hand through his silver hair. "I've been in this town a long time, Morgan. Longer than most of those kids have been alive. They act like I'm some relic. But here's the thing. They'll never have the kind of legacy we do, because they're too scared to take risks. Too scared to upset the wrong people." He swirled his whiskey. "They don't make 'em like us anymore." Morgan grinned. "Damn right they don't." For a moment, the two men sat in comfortable silence, letting the weight of their words settle. They had seen Hollywood change, watched it evolve into something almost unrecognizable, but despite all the noise, all the attacks, they were still here, still standing. After a while, Clint looked over at Morgan. "You ever think about walking away from it all?" Morgan exhaled, staring into his glass. "Sometimes. But then I remember, this industry still needs real storytellers. It still needs men like us who aren't afraid to tell the truth." Clint chuckled. "Guess we ain't done yet, huh?" Morgan shook his head, lifting his glass. "Not even close." They clinked glasses and drank. Two legends, unmoved by the storm, knowing that no matter how loud the critics got, their legacy would speak louder. The young man, still in awe, took his seat, gripping his glass like it was some kind of sacred relic. He wasn't sure whether to speak or just listen, but Morgan made it easy for him. "So, kid," Morgan said, setting his empty glass down. "What's your name?" "Daniel," the young man replied quickly. "Daniel Carter." Clint leaned back, studying him with that familiar, unreadable squint. "You in the business, Daniel?" Daniel nodded eagerly. "Yeah, well, trying to be. I'm a screenwriter, just starting out." Morgan and Clint exchanged knowing glances. They'd seen 100 young hopefuls come and go, but something about this kid's earnestness made them listen. "So what kind of stories do you want to tell?" Morgan asked. Daniel hesitated. "Honestly, the kind you guys tell. Stories. With grit. Characters with depth. Something real, but He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. That's not exactly what they're looking for these days. Clint scoffed. Kid, they weren't looking for it when I started either. Hollywood's always been a machine, running on trends and politics. But if you've got a real story to tell, you don't let that stop you. Morgan nodded. You're gonna have people telling you what you should write, what's safe, what fits the narrative. Ignore them. The moment you start writing for approval instead of truth, you've already lost. Daniel exhaled, leaning forward. But how do you push through? I mean, you guys are... Well, you guys. You can say what you want, but someone like me? If I step out of line, I'm done before I even start. Clint smirked. Let me tell you something, kid. Back in the day, people thought I was crazy for making Unforgiven. Said it was too dark, too different. Thought I should stick to the tough guy roles people expected. But I made the damn movie anyway. And now, it's one of the best westerns ever made. He took another sip of whiskey. You don't wait for permission, you make them pay attention. Morgan chuckled. That's Clint's way of saying, grow a backbone. Daniel smiled, shaking his head. I guess I just needed to hear it from people who've been through it. Morgan leaned in, his voice lowering. Daniel, listen to me. Hollywood's gonna try to mold you, shape you into what's convenient for them. But the real ones, the ones who last, they don't follow, they lead. Clint finished his drink and set it down with a quiet thud. Question is, kid, do you have it in you? Daniel met Clint's gaze, the weight of the moment settling over him. He nodded. Yeah, I think I do. Morgan smiled. Then don't. Think. No. The bartender came over, refilling their glasses, sensing this was a moment worth savoring. Daniel, still absorbing everything, hesitated before raising his glass. Morgan and Clint did the same. To real stories, Morgan said. To telling the truth, Clint added. Daniel grinned. To not asking for permission. Their glasses clinked, sealing a moment that would stay with Daniel forever. As the night wore on, they kept talking. About movies, about Hollywood, about standing your ground in a world that rewards conformity. And when Daniel finally left, stepping out into the cool night air, he didn't feel like just another hopeful screenwriter. He felt ready. The next morning, Morgan Freeman woke up to a flurry of missed calls and messages. His phone, usually quiet until noon, was buzzing like a beehive. He groaned, sat up, and reached for it, squinting at the screen. Headlines everywhere. Morgan Freeman's blistering defense of Clint Eastwood sends shockwaves through Hollywood. Freeman and Eastwood, the last of Hollywood's rebels? Cancel culture just met its match. Morgan Freeman and Clint Eastwood fire back. Morgan chuckled, shaking his head. Well, damn, he muttered. Before he could even process it all, his phone rang again. Clint Eastwood. Morgan answered. Well, look at that, old man. Looks like we're troublemakers again. Clint's gravelly laugh came through the line. I woke up to 20 voicemails and a dozen reporters asking for a follow-up. Guess you really rattled their cage, Morgan. Morgan smirked. I didn't rattle anything. I just reminded them that some of us aren't scared of their nonsense. Clint sighed. It's funny. They act like we're controversial for just telling the truth. Meanwhile, half of them wouldn't last a day in the Hollywood we started in. Morgan laughed. Ain't that the truth? Clint's tone shifted. You see the kid's name popping up? Morgan raised an eyebrow. Daniel? Yeah. That reporter kid, what was his name? Mark something. Tweeted that Daniel was seen talking to us last night, and now all these industry types are suddenly interested in him. Morgan pulled up his phone, and sure enough, there it was. A viral tweet showing a blurry photo of Daniel sitting with them at the bar, captioned, Up-and-coming screenwriter Daniel Carter gets a masterclass from legends Morgan Freeman and Clint Eastwood. If he's smart, he'll listen. Morgan smiled. Looks like the kid's got a head start now. Clint chuckled. Let's just hope he's got the guts to follow through. Morgan leaned back, watching the headlines pour in, knowing full well that Hollywood was about to have a field day with this. But for all the noise, for all the think pieces and debates that would follow, one thing was certain. He and Clint weren't going anywhere. And as for Daniel, well, if the kid played his cards right, He was about to learn the most important lesson in Hollywood. Truth always outlasts trends. A few days later, Daniel Carter sat in a small coffee shop in Los Angeles, his laptop open but his mind racing too fast to focus. Ever since that night at the bar, his phone hadn't stopped buzzing. Producers, agents, even a few journalists wanted to talk to him. Some were genuinely curious about his work. Others were fishing for controversy, hoping to twist his connection with Clint Eastwood and Morgan Freeman into something scandalous. But Daniel wasn't stupid. He had seen what happened to people who let the industry mold them. He wasn't about to be their pawn. As he scrolled through his emails, a new message popped up from an unknown number. The subject line was simple: "Keep writing." Daniel hesitated, then clicked it open. "Daniel, you're gonna get offers. Some will sound too good to be true. Some will come with strings attached. Stay smart. Tell the stories you believe in, not the ones they want you to tell. Morgan." Daniel exhaled. If there was ever a sign to stay the course, this was it. Just then, his phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. He almost ignored it, but something told him to answer. "Hello?" "Daniel, this is Clint Eastwood." Daniel nearly dropped his coffee. Mr. Eastwood?" "Yeah. Listen, kid, I don't usually do this, but I've been thinking about what you said the other night. About how you want to tell real stories." "Yes, sir," Daniel said, his heart pounding. "Well," Clint continued, "I've got a script sitting on my desk. Needs a fresh perspective, and I don't trust most of these Hollywood types to do it right. You interested?" Daniel swallowed hard. "Are you serious?" "I don't make jokes," Clint said. "You in or not?" Daniel took a deep breath, gripping the phone. He thought about every rejection, every doubt, every moment where he felt like the industry would swallow him whole. Then he remembered what Morgan had told him. "Don't ask for permission." "I'm in," he said firmly. Clint chuckled. "Good. Welcome to the real Hollywood, kid." As the call ended, Daniel sat back in his chair, staring at his laptop. A week ago, he was just another aspiring writer, stuck in a system that didn't care if he sank or swam. Now, he was about to work with Clint Eastwood, and the best part, he had done it on his own terms.